When did your professor discover that some grades can be challenged? I was sitting in the dean's office at 3:42 p.m. on a Thursday in November when Professor Whitmore walked in and saw the stack of printed emails on the desk between us. His face went from confused to pale in about 2 seconds. The emails were between him and another student, dated over the past 6 months, showing he'd been selling grade changes for $500 each. My name was on 3 of them as examples of students he claimed wouldn't notice if their grades dropped slightly to make room for the paying customers. I'd noticed. I'd spent 3 weeks documenting everything before I walked into this office, and now Professor Whitmore was standing in the doorway looking at proof of his own corruption printed out in Times New Roman, 12-point font. Dean Foster didn't even look up from the papers when she said, "Close the door, Richard. We need to talk about your grading practices." I watched his hand shake as he reached for the door handle. Good. He should be shaking. I'd been a student at Riverside State University for 3.5 years when everything started unraveling. I was a senior majoring in biochemistry with a 3.87 GPA, planning to apply to medical schools the following year. I needed strong grades in my upper-level science courses to stay competitive. Professor Richard Whitmore taught advanced molecular biology, a required course for my major. Everyone said he was tough but fair, that his exams were brutal, but his curve was generous. I registered for his class in August, showed up on the first day ready to work hard, and spent the entire semester busting my ass on every assignment. The course met Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 a.m. in the Science Building's largest lecture hall. About 90 students were enrolled, mostly seniors and a few ambitious juniors. Professor Whitmore was in his late 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been teaching at Riverside for 22 years and had a reputation as one of the department's most respected faculty members. He'd published extensively, served on university committees, and won teaching awards. On paper, he was exactly the kind of professor you wanted for a critical course. The first exam was in late September. I'd studied for 2 weeks straight, memorizing protein structures, metabolic pathways, and gene regulation mechanisms. The exam was 50 multiple-choice questions and 3 essay questions. I walked out feeling confident I'd scored at least an 88, maybe higher. When grades were posted a week later, I got a 73. I was shocked, but told myself I must have misunderstood some of the material. I went to Professor Whitmore's office hours to review my exam. He pulled it from his filing cabinet and went through it with me. My multiple-choice section had 43 correct out of 50, which should have been 86%. But he'd marked 3 of my correct answers as wrong, circling them in red pen and writing incorrect next to them. When I pointed out that my answers matched the answer key he'd posted online, he said there had been an error in the key, and those questions were being regraded with the correct answers. I asked why I hadn't been notified of the correction, and he said he'd sent an email to the class. I checked my inbox right there in his office and showed him I'd never received it. He shrugged and said email systems were unreliable. He refused to adjust my score. The second exam was in late October. I studied even harder this time, making sure I understood every concept at a deeper level. I checked and double-checked my answers before submitting. This exam had 60 multiple-choice questions and 2 essay questions worth 40 points total. I knew I'd aced it. When grades posted, I got a 76. My hands were shaking when I saw the score. I went back to his office hours immediately. This time, my multiple-choice section showed 52 correct out of 60, which should have been 87%. But he'd given me only 18 out of 40 points on the essays, even though my answers were detailed and accurate. I'd compared my essays with the sample answers he provided in the study guide, and mine covered all the same points. Professor Whitmore told me my writing was unclear and lacked depth, even though I'd specifically addressed every part of the rubric he'd provided. When I asked him to explain what was unclear, he got irritated and said I was being argumentative. He told me if I continued questioning his professional judgment, it might affect how he viewed my class participation grade. I left his office feeling sick. Something was wrong. I was a strong student in every other class. My grades in organic chemistry, cell biology, and genetics were all in the low 90s. But somehow, in Whitmore's class, I kept scoring in the mid-70s, despite putting in more effort than anywhere else. I told myself maybe I just wasn't good at his specific teaching style. Maybe I was missing something everyone else understood. I tried to rationalize it, but the numbers didn't make sense. A friend in the class, Sophie, was scoring in the high 80s consistently. I'd studied with her before the second exam, and we'd answered the practice questions almost identically. How was she scoring 15 points higher than me? I asked her after class one day if she'd noticed anything strange about the grading. She looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. That's when I started paying closer attention to everything. The third exam was in mid-November. I decided to document everything this time. I took photos of my exam before submitting it, using my phone to capture every answer I'd written. I made sure the photos were clear and time-stamped. When grades posted a week later, I got a 71, my lowest score yet, even though I'd been more prepared for this exam than the previous two. I printed out the photos of my original exam and went to Professor Whitmore's office. When he pulled my graded exam from his cabinet, I compared it to my photos side by side. 5 of my answers had been changed. Not marked wrong, but actually changed. Where I'd originally written the correct answer, someone had erased it and written something incorrect, then marked it wrong in red pen. The handwriting wasn't mine. I'd used blue ink on the exam. The changed answers were in black ink. My stomach dropped when I realized what I was seeing. Professor Whitmore had physically altered my exam to lower my score. I sat there staring at the evidence while Professor Whitmore watched me. "Is there a problem?" he asked, in that same calm tone he used during lectures. I held up my phone showing the original photos next to his graded version. These answers were changed after I submitted my exam. The handwriting is different. The ink color is different. Someone altered my test to make it wrong. He looked at the photos without any change in expression. Then he looked at me and said, "That's a serious accusation. Are you suggesting I would tamper with a student's exam?" His voice was cold now. "Alternatively, you might have taken those photos after the exam was returned, falsified them to make yourself look better, and are now trying to extort a grade change from me. That would be academic dishonesty, which carries serious consequences, including expulsion." I felt the blood drain from my face. He was threatening me. He was actually threatening to have me expelled for catching him cheating. I stood up, grabbed my exam and my phone, and walked out without another word. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I went straight to the library and uploaded the photos to 3 different cloud storage services with timestamps. Then I started researching what to do. Riverside State had an academic grievance process through the dean's office. Students could challenge grades if they believed they'd been unfairly evaluated, but the process required proof, and it required going up against a professor with 22 years of tenure and multiple teaching awards. I'd be a student with photos that Professor Whitmore would claim were fabricated. It would be my word against his, and I knew whose word the university would believe. I needed more evidence. I needed something irrefutable. I decided to document everything going forward and see if I could find other students experiencing the same thing. If this was a pattern, it would be harder to dismiss. I started with Sophie since I knew she was in the class and had seemed uncomfortable when I'd asked about grading before. I found her in the student union the next day and asked directly if anything weird had happened with her grades in Whitmore's class. She looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then told me she'd noticed her grades were higher than expected, but she hadn't questioned it because she was grateful. She'd failed the first exam by her own assessment, maybe scored around 60%, but her posted grade was 88. She'd assumed Whitmore had a generous curve. When I told her what was happening to me, her face went pale. She said about 6 weeks ago, another student named Justin had approached her asking if she'd be willing to participate in a study group that involved paying for tutoring sessions with Professor Whitmore. The cost was $500 per session, and grades would reflect the additional effort. She'd said no because she couldn't afford it, and it sounded sketchy. But Justin had signed up and his grades had mysteriously improved from failing to passing. I asked Sophie if she'd be willing to make a statement about this if I filed a formal complaint. She hesitated, then said she was afraid of retaliation. Professor Whitmore controlled who got research opportunities in the department, who got recommendation letters for graduate programs, who got teaching assistant positions. Crossing him could destroy your future in the sciences. I understood her fear because I felt it too, but I also knew I couldn't let this continue. I thanked her for the information and asked her to think about it. Then I went looking for Justin. I found him in the biochemistry computer lab later that week. He was a junior with a 2.4 GPA, struggling to maintain his scholarship. When I mentioned Professor Whitmore's class, Justin got defensive immediately. He said he'd worked hard for his grades and didn't appreciate accusations, but when I told him I had proof that Whitmore was altering exams and that I suspected Justin had paid for grade changes, his defensiveness turned to panic. He asked how I knew. I showed him the photos of my altered exam. Justin stared at the photos for a long moment, then pulled out his phone. He showed me a series of text messages from a number he said belonged to Professor Whitmore, though the contact name just said RW. The messages discussed payment arrangements and which assignments would be adjusted after Justin submitted them. One message explicitly said, "Your exam will be graded favorably after the $500 transfer clears. Other students' grades may be lowered to maintain appropriate curve distribution. This arrangement remains confidential." My heart was pounding reading those messages. This was proof. Actual documentary evidence that Whitmore was selling grades and deliberately lowering other students' scores to hide the inflation. Justin said there were at least 4 other students involved in the same arrangement. He'd heard about it through a friend who'd graduated the previous year. It was an open secret among students who could afford it that Professor Whitmore would improve your grade if you paid him. The cost was $500 per course, usually paid through Venmo or direct bank transfer to avoid university financial systems. I asked Justin why he was showing me this if he was participating in the scheme. He said he felt guilty about it, but was desperate to keep his scholarship. His family couldn't afford tuition without it, and he'd been failing the course legitimately before he paid. He'd rationalized it as paying for private tutoring, but seeing my altered exam made him realize how wrong it was. Other students were being hurt to cover for the students who paid. He said he'd back me up if I reported it, but he was terrified of the consequences. I told him I was terrified too, but we didn't have a choice. This was fraud. This was corruption. This was affecting people's futures and academic records. We couldn't just let it continue because we were scared. Justin nodded slowly and said he'd forward me all the messages from Professor Whitmore if I promised to report it properly through official channels. I promised. He sent me the message thread right there, and I backed it up to the cloud immediately. Over the next week, I found 3 more students who'd paid Professor Whitmore for grade changes. All of them had similar message threads showing explicit pay-for-grades arrangements. One student, Keisha, had actually signed a written contract with Whitmore outlining the arrangement. She showed me a scanned copy she'd kept. The contract stated she was paying for supplementary educational consulting services, but included specific grade targets for each exam and assignment. It was worded carefully to sound legitimate if anyone glanced at it, but the intent was obvious. The contract had Professor Whitmore's signature at the bottom, dated from September of this year. Keisha said she'd wanted documentation of the arrangement in case he tried to back out after taking her money. She'd paid $750 total across 2 installments. She was willing to provide the contract as evidence, but was worried about being charged with academic dishonesty herself. I told her she needed to consult with a lawyer about that, but I thought cooperating with an investigation would work in her favor compared to staying silent. I now had photos of my altered exam, text messages from multiple students showing pay-for-grades arrangements, and a signed contract from Professor Whitmore. I had enough evidence to file a formal complaint, but I wanted one more thing. I wanted to catch him in the act of offering the arrangement to someone. I asked a friend from a different major, Daniel, if he'd be willing to help with a sting operation. Daniel wasn't in Whitmore's class, so he had no stake in this. He agreed to pose as a struggling student and approach Whitmore during office hours, asking if there was any way to improve his grades through alternative methods, because he'd heard from other students that arrangements could be made. Daniel wore a wire, actually just his phone in his shirt pocket with a recording app running. Rhode Island is a one-party consent state for recording. So as long as Daniel consented to recording his own conversation, it was legal. This was crucial because I needed the recording to be admissible if this went to a formal investigation. Daniel went to Whitmore's office hours on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. The recording captured the entire conversation. Professor Whitmore initially played dumb, asking what Daniel meant by arrangements. Daniel pushed gently, saying he'd heard from friends that there were tutoring services available that significantly improved grades. Whitmore remained cautious, asking who'd told Daniel about this. Daniel gave a fake name of a student who'd supposedly graduated last year. Whitmore seemed to relax slightly after that. He said that for select students who demonstrated serious commitment to their education, he occasionally offered supplementary consulting services. These services came with an associated fee to compensate for his time. The fee was $500 paid via Venmo or bank transfer, and in exchange, the students' grades would reflect a more accurate assessment of their potential rather than just their test-taking abilities. He said the arrangement was confidential, and if Daniel discussed it with anyone, the agreement would be terminated and his grades would be evaluated strictly by the numbers. The recording was damning. Professor Whitmore had explicitly offered to change grades in exchange for payment. He'd done it carefully, using euphemistic language, but the intent was crystal clear. Daniel left the office and immediately brought the recording to me. I listened to it 3 times to make sure I'd heard correctly. Then I spent 2 days organizing all my evidence into a formal complaint packet. I had photos of my altered exam with timestamps. I had message threads from 5 different students showing explicit pay-for-grades arrangements. I had a signed contract from Professor Whitmore. I had a recording of him offering the service to an undercover student. I had grade data from the course showing suspicious patterns where some students' grades jumped significantly mid-semester while others dropped, even though the statistical distribution should have remained more consistent. Everything was documented, organized, and backed up in multiple locations. I drafted a 12-page complaint letter detailing everything I'd discovered, explaining each piece of evidence, and listing all the students willing to provide testimony. On a Monday morning in late November, I walked into the Dean of Academic Affairs office and requested an emergency meeting. The administrative assistant tried to schedule me for the following week, but I said this involved ongoing academic fraud and couldn't wait. She looked alarmed and went to talk to Dean Foster. 5 minutes later, I was sitting across from Dean Victoria Foster, a woman in her 60s who'd been at Riverside for 35 years and served as dean for the last 8. I handed her the printed complaint packet and waited while she read through it. I watched her face change as she went through each section. Confusion turned to concern, then to anger. When she reached the recording transcript, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You recorded a professor without his knowledge?" she asked. I explained the one-party consent law and that the recording was legal. She nodded slowly and kept reading. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at me directly. "Mr. Reeves, these are very serious accusations against a tenured faculty member. If proven true, this would be the most significant academic fraud case this university has seen in decades. If not proven true, you could face consequences for making false accusations." I met her eyes and said I understood the stakes. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't certain. I'd spent weeks documenting everything because I knew I'd need irrefutable proof. Dean Foster asked if the other students mentioned in my complaint would be willing to testify. I said yes, though some were afraid of retaliation. She said if an investigation moved forward, the university would protect witnesses from retaliation to the best of their ability. She asked for contact information for all the students I'd mentioned. I provided a list I'd prepared in advance with names, student ID numbers, and email addresses. Dean Foster said she needed to review the evidence more thoroughly and consult with the university's legal counsel before deciding how to proceed. She asked me not to discuss this with anyone, including Professor Whitmore, until they determined next steps. I agreed. She said she'd contact me within 48 hours. I left her office feeling simultaneously relieved that I'd finally reported it and terrified about what would happen next. The next 2 days were torture. I went to classes and tried to act normal, but my mind was racing constantly. What if the university decided to protect Professor Whitmore instead of investigating? What if they turned this around on me somehow? What if the other students backed out of testifying? I'd put everything on the line with this complaint. If it didn't work, my academic career at Riverside was probably over. Professor Whitmore would find ways to make my life miserable, and I'd still need his recommendation letter for medical school applications. I'd basically burned that bridge the moment I walked into Dean Foster's office. But I couldn't unknow what I knew. I couldn't let him keep defrauding students and destroying their chances at fair grades. Someone had to stop him, and apparently that someone was me. Dean Foster called me on Wednesday afternoon and asked me to come to her office Thursday at 3:30 p.m. She said Professor Whitmore had been asked to attend the meeting as well, and the university's legal counsel would be present. This was the official start of the investigation. I felt my stomach drop. I'd be in the same room as Whitmore, essentially accusing him of fraud to his face, with lawyers present. I barely slept Wednesday night. I kept going over everything in my mind, making sure my story was straight, that my evidence was solid, that I hadn't missed anything. By Thursday morning, I was exhausted but wired with nervous energy. I spent the day in the library reviewing my evidence packet one more time. At 3:25 p.m., I walked across campus to the administration building and took the elevator to the third floor where Dean Foster's office was located. The scene I described at the beginning happened at 3:42 p.m., 12 minutes into the meeting. Professor Whitmore had arrived a few minutes after me, clearly not knowing what the meeting was about. Dean Foster had waited until he sat down before placing the printed evidence on the desk between us. The look on his face when he saw those emails was something I'll never forget. Pure panic, followed by a desperate attempt to regain composure. Dean Foster introduced the university's legal counsel, attorney Mark Livingston, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner taking notes. Mark explained that the university had received a formal complaint of academic misconduct and that Professor Whitmore was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Professor Whitmore tried to interrupt, saying this was outrageous, that he was being ambushed, that he had no idea what they were talking about. Dean Foster slid the evidence packet across the desk. "Perhaps you'd like to review the documentation before you make any statements," she said calmly. I watched Professor Whitmore flip through the pages. His hands were shaking now. He got to the text messages and his face went red. He got to the recorded conversation transcript and his breathing got faster. When he finished, he looked up at me with pure hatred in his eyes. "You set me up," he said, his voice tight. "You sent someone to entrap me." Attorney Livingston spoke before I could respond. "Professor Whitmore, I'd advise you to stop talking and consult with your own legal representation before making any statements about these allegations." But Whitmore kept going. He said I was a vindictive student who couldn't accept that I wasn't as smart as I thought I was, that I'd fabricated evidence because I was failing his class legitimately, that the other students were lying to save their own academic standings, that the recording was taken out of context. Dean Foster let him finish, then said quietly, "Richard, we've already contacted 3 of the students mentioned in the complaint. They've confirmed receiving similar offers from you and have provided additional documentation. This is not a single disgruntled student. This is a pattern spanning multiple semesters." Professor Whitmore went silent. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. He slumped in his chair and put his head in his hands. "I needed the money," he said finally. "My wife's medical bills. She's been sick for 3 years. Insurance doesn't cover everything. I was just trying to help students who were struggling while covering my costs. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." It was the first time he'd admitted to anything, and Attorney Livingston looked like he wanted to tackle Whitmore to stop him from talking. But once he started, he kept going. He said it had begun 2 years ago with just one student who'd offered him money for a grade change. He'd refused at first, but the student kept pushing, explaining their situation, offering more money. Eventually, he'd rationalized it as a victimless transaction. The student got the grade they wanted. He got money he desperately needed for medical bills, and no one was hurt. But then other students heard about it. Word spread quietly. The amount increased to $500 to make it worth the risk. He'd started lowering other students' grades slightly to maintain the curve and avoid suspicion about grade inflation. Dean Foster asked how many students had been involved over the past 2 years. Professor Whitmore said he didn't know exactly, maybe 20, maybe 30. He'd never kept records because he knew it was wrong. Attorney Livingston actually groaned and put his head in his hands at that admission. Dean Foster said the investigation would now expand to review all of Professor Whitmore's grades for the past 3 academic years. Every student who'd taken his courses during that time would be contacted and given the opportunity to have their grades reviewed. Professor Whitmore's teaching duties were suspended effective immediately. He was banned from campus, pending the outcome of the investigation. If the allegations were substantiated, He would face disciplinary action up to and including termination, and the matter would be referred to law enforcement for potential criminal charges of fraud and theft by deception. Professor Whitmore was told to leave campus immediately and would be contacted by the university within a week about next steps. He stood up slowly, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour, and walked out without looking at anyone. After he left, Dean Foster turned to me. "Mr. Reeves, I want to thank you for bringing this forward. What Professor Whitmore did was a betrayal of everything this university stands for. I'm sorry you were victimized by someone you should have been able to trust." She said my grade in the course would be recalculated based on my exam photos and the evidence of altered answers. She estimated my actual grade should have been in the low 90s based on my demonstrated knowledge. I would receive a formal grade correction and a letter for my academic file explaining the situation. She also said the university would be offering free counseling services to all affected students, as this kind of betrayal could be traumatizing. Attorney Livingston added that I should keep all my documentation and might be contacted by investigators or potentially law enforcement if criminal charges were filed. I thanked them both and left the office feeling drained. The adrenaline that had been keeping me going for weeks finally wore off, and I felt exhausted. The investigation moved quickly once it started. Within a week, the university had contacted over 200 students who'd taken Professor Whitmore's courses in the past 3 years. They sent detailed surveys asking about any unusual grading patterns, offers of grade changes for payment, or other concerning behavior. The response was overwhelming. 43 students came forward with evidence of similar arrangements. Some had paid, others had been offered the arrangement but declined. Several had noticed their grades being lowered suspiciously, but hadn't understood why. The university hired an external forensic accounting firm to trace payments. They found over $45,000 in transfers to Professor Whitmore's personal accounts from student accounts over the past 2 years. The payments were usually labeled as things like tutoring or consulting to avoid suspicion, but the pattern was clear when analyzed comprehensively. The accounting firm also found that Professor Whitmore had been systematically lowering grades for students who didn't pay while inflating grades for students who did, maintaining an average GPA in his courses that looked statistically normal to avoid triggering any automated red flags in the university's systems. The story broke in the campus newspaper 2 weeks after my meeting with Dean Foster. The headline read, "Biochemistry Professor Suspended Amid Grade-Selling Scandal." The article detailed the investigation, the number of students affected, and the amount of money involved. It quoted Dean Foster saying the university was taking the matter extremely seriously and was cooperating with law enforcement. Local news picked up the story the next day. Suddenly, my inbox was flooded with interview requests from reporters. I declined all of them. I'd done what needed to be done, but I didn't want to become the public face of this scandal. I just wanted my grades corrected and to move forward with my education. Some of the students who'd paid Professor Whitmore were facing their own disciplinary proceedings for violating academic integrity policies. The university decided to handle those cases individually based on circumstances. Students who could prove they'd been coerced or manipulated were given academic probation and required to retake affected courses. Students who'd actively sought out the arrangement faced harsher penalties, including suspension. The criminal investigation took longer. The district attorney's office assigned a prosecutor named Rebecca Nolan, who specialized in white-collar crime. She spent 3 months building a case against Professor Whitmore, interviewing students, reviewing financial records, and consulting with forensic experts. In late February, almost 3 months after my initial complaint, Professor Whitmore was formally charged with 28 counts of theft by deception, 28 counts of fraud, and 1 count of official misconduct. Each count of theft corresponded to a student he'd taken money from. The official misconduct charge related to his abuse of his position as a professor. If convicted on all counts, he faced up to 15 years in prison and hundreds of thousands in fines. His attorney negotiated a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to 10 counts of theft and 1 count of fraud, the other charges would be dropped and he'd receive a sentence of 5 years with possibility of parole after 3, plus full restitution to all victims. The sentencing hearing was in April. Several students gave victim impact statements, including me. I talked about how Professor Whitmore's actions had made me question my own abilities and knowledge. How I'd spent months thinking I was failing when actually I was being sabotaged. How his betrayal of trust had damaged my confidence and my relationship with academia. I talked about the stress of documenting evidence and filing the complaint, not knowing if I'd be believed or retaliated against. Other students shared similar experiences. Some had considered dropping out of their majors because of grades in his class. One student had lost a scholarship because of artificially lowered grades. Another had been rejected from graduate programs and had to reapply after the grades were corrected. The judge listened to all of it, then sentenced Professor Whitmore to 4 years in state prison, followed by 5 years probation. He was also ordered to pay $52,000 in restitution to students and the university, and his teaching license was permanently revoked. He'd never work in education again. The university implemented sweeping reforms after the scandal. They established an independent academic integrity office that reports directly to the Board of Trustees instead of through the administrative chain. They implemented new oversight systems for grading, including random audits of grade changes and statistical analysis to detect suspicious patterns. They created a whistleblower protection policy specifically for students reporting academic misconduct. And they established a fund to provide legal support for students involved in academic grievance cases, so students wouldn't have to fight professors alone. Dean Foster personally called me in May to thank me again and to tell me about these changes. She said what I'd done required tremendous courage and had ultimately made Riverside a better institution. She said I should be proud of standing up when it would have been easier to stay silent. My grades were officially corrected. My final grade in advanced molecular biology changed from a 74 to a 93. My GPA jumped to 3.94. I graduated summa cum laude the following spring and was accepted to 3 medical schools, eventually choosing to attend one that specifically valued ethical leadership and integrity. During my medical school interviews, several admissions committees asked about the experience. I was honest about what had happened and what I'd learned from it. I said it had taught me that systems only work when people are willing to challenge them when they fail. That authority figures aren't always right and shouldn't be blindly trusted. That documentation and evidence matter more than reputation or status. And that speaking up about injustice, even when it's terrifying, is worth it if it prevents others from being hurt. Looking back now, I'm grateful I documented everything before going to Dean Foster. If I'd gone in with just my story and no proof, nothing would have happened. Professor Whitmore would have denied everything, I would have been labeled a troublemaker, and the fraud would have continued. But because I spent weeks building an irrefutable case, because I found other victims, because I recorded that conversation, the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The system worked, but only because I forced it to work by giving it no other choice. That's the lesson I carry with me. Institutions can be forces for good, but they need people willing to hold them accountable when they fail. Professor Whitmore thought his position and reputation made him untouchable. He thought students were too afraid or too powerless to challenge him. He was wrong. I still have copies of all the evidence saved in multiple locations. Sometimes I look through it and remember how terrifying it was to walk into Dean Foster's office with that complaint. How close I came to just accepting the bad grades and moving on because fighting seemed impossible. But I also remember the relief on other students' faces when they learned their grades would be corrected. The gratitude from people who'd been hurt and hadn't known how to fight back. The policy changes that will protect future students from similar abuse. Professor Whitmore discovered that some grades can be challenged when I walked into that office with 12 pages of evidence and refused to be intimidated. He learned that corruption has consequences when 43 students came forward to confirm his fraud. He learned that justice delayed isn't justice denied when he was sentenced to prison for betraying the trust of students who looked to him for education and guidance. If you made it this far, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.